chemical manufacturers. We've benefited from ISDS throughout the history of the U.S. FTA program and the BIT program. Since 1997, our companies have made numerous claims using ISDS against foreign government actions. And ISDS gives our companies recourse when local courts have not addressed the problem. FTAs with ISDS have created better climates for investment as well as trade-related economic growth. And most of the benefit of ISDS is really, as Marty said, it's an enforcement mechanism. So we benefit through the existence of ISDS, not necessarily just through its use. And I'd like to compare ISDS as it's almost like the WTO agreement. It's there to prevent trade barriers from happening. The ISDS is there to prevent investment barriers from happening. So we share some of the concerns that have been mentioned already today. It's very concerning to us that Canada has chosen to opt out. We have a lot of investments in Canada, and a number of the cases over the course of the history of NAFTA were with respect to measures in Canada. We're concerned about the contract requirement. Many of our companies do not have direct contracts with the Mexican government. That's a very unusual case for a chemical company. And we're also worried that it limits the ISDS protections from the original NAFTA. So, for example, a chemical sector company can only make claim on post-establishment national treatment and most favored nation treatment violations and direct expropriations, as Ted mentioned. And we're also concerned about the exhaustion period for making those types of claims. It went from 6 months under the original NAFTA to 30 months, that's practically speaking a disincentive to making an ISDS claim. That's a very long time to go through the local court system. And there are various ways that I think we could think about how to make improvements to this outcome, and I'd be happy to talk about those ways in the question and answer period.
Great. Thank you, Ed. Let's get right into it. Each of you in your opening remarks has alluded to the sectoral limitations with respect to Annex 14E. So my question is, do you see this as a rational policy decision to confine the most robust form of ISDS to those 5 groups of activities? Or is this just a raw political compromise reflecting some skepticism about ISDS generally, but a grudging concession to those 5 particular sectors? So rational policy choice or political compromise? Marty?
Thanks, Ted. So I've been searching for the rational policy choice to figure out what it could be that was driving this. And one rational policy choice might be what Aaron mentioned, this idea that somehow we're keeping investment at home. I don't think that rationale works. These are all, the favored sectors are all areas that have been affected by Mexico's regulatory liberalization in recent years, particularly the 2013 energy reform. They are all areas, more or less, that were part of the high-level economic dialogue between Mexico and Canada that was handled under the Obama administration. These were areas that were identified as priority areas for investment. So that's what I could come up with as a rational policy rationale. But I don't think it works for a couple of reasons. One is there's really some surprising exclusions. What about other extractive industries? Mining. I mean, when you mine, you go to where the minerals are. You can't mine more in the U.S. Instead of Mexico. If Mexico has some kind of minerals where a U.S. mining company would like to mine that, they're going to be in competition with other multinational mining companies, for that concession. I can't for the life of me understand, even under this more limited rubric, why an extractive industry sector like mining, that like these other sectors have been frequent users of ISDS, would not be afforded these protections. But take other industries like insurance. They also, for regulatory reasons, if they want to offer their services abroad, and that's a way for their business to expand, then they, need to be established there and make investments there. And yet those investments are excluded. So even if you looked at this as trying to maybe protect those that you think would kind of, quote, have to go into that market anyway, I think it still falls short because it excludes important sectors of the U.S. economy that also need to be investing in Mexico to be competitive.
Ed?
I think it's difficult for us to identify that policy rationale as well. Many of the industries that are in Annex 14E are just as capital intensive as we are. They may be exposed to one type of political risk because by the very nature of what they're doing, but for chemical manufacturing companies, we're a highly regulated sector in most countries in the world, and the types of investment violations that occur are really indirect expropriations. So they're regulatory takings, and the regulatory risk, I think, is what gives us the most pause, particularly when you have Mexico opening up its oil and gas sector, perhaps opening up to more reforms of its chemical management regime. We want to make sure that we have a good backstop for protecting those investments. And I'll just say that in Mexico, last year, we invested about $6.3 billion, and that's about 6% of all U.S. FDI in Mexico, so it's not inconsiderable. And for Canada, that's $17.6 billion of chemical manufacturing investment in 2017, and that's about 5% of all U.S. FDI in Canada is chemical manufacturing. So we feel like we're being arbitrarily left on the outside of that select group.
Can I just follow up on that, Ed? Bearing that in mind, are you advocating with USTR now for inclusion in Annex 14?
We have tried to express the importance of ISDS to USTR and how critical it is for the U.S. chemical sector, not just for this agreement, but I think all the agreements that the United States government intends to negotiate in the future. We don't want this to be the precedent. So I think the contract requirement is difficult for us because, again, our companies normally do not have contracts directly with the national authority. They're engaged in private contracts. So even if you kept that requirement and you added us to the list, I'm not sure it would be very much of a benefit.
From an API member company perspective, we support the sufficiency for our members that we see in the USMCA, but we do not view it as a precedent by which we think that even our sector should be made eligible for ISDS and covered by investment protections in other bilateral investment treaties and other trade agreements that the U.S. may even now be undertaking in negotiations. For all the reasons that Ed and Marnie explained, we think that investment protections in ISDS are good for all sectors and they're good for U.S. interests, regardless of sector. We're glad that it was considered sufficiently with regards to our sector for this trade agreement. We're fortunate in that regard, but throughout our discussions with USTR over the course of the negotiations, we were very clear that we didn't think that it was right to distinguish sectors, even if it would end up in the way that it did, that it would favor our sector sufficiently. Because we have heard and recognized from our conversations with our industry colleagues throughout these negotiations of the reasons why they invest in foreign markets, much as the chemical sector does in the ways that Ed described, and the ways in which we were always able to tie it back to a very similar sense that we had of the U.S. national interests that are represented in that. And so we didn't see any clear enough distinction in treating sectors differently such that we think that this is a good precedent. While it's sufficient for our sector, we would still articulate to U.S. negotiators and will articulate to U.S. negotiators that there shouldn't be sectoral distinctions. We should revert to the way in which this is articulated in the U.S. model bilateral investment treaty, in that it doesn't provide some benefits to some sectors and not to others. We would prefer to go back to a sector agnostic set of coverage.
If I could just add one more thing, and that is the other thing I did think about is what about U.S. defensive concerns? In these selected sectors, there, in some cases, isn't a lot of U.S. federal government contracting. And in other cases, it's hard to see that Mexican investors are actually very competitive in this space where there is federal government contracting. And so to the extent that it's a defensive move so that the U.S. doesn't think they're exposed, that's another policy rationale I explored. That said, I think everyone in this room likely knows the U.S. has not had to defend as many ISDS cases as Mexico and Canada, and they've won every single case. And I certainly, it's hard to see that defensive rationale kind of helps explain the random line that's been drawn.
Both Ed and Marty have talked about this contract requirement, and I want to explore that a little bit because it seems quite unusual. We've seen in past FTAs and bilateral investment treaties, we've seen references to what are known as investment agreements, sort of a specialized kind of government contract. And we've seen treaties and trade agreements that allow for treaty or trade agreement-based dispute settlement with respect to those particular categories of agreements. But that's not what's going on here. That's not what the reference to these special central government contracts in USMCA is all about. This is really more like your admission ticket. This is the one of the conditions that says if you've got this and you're in one of these sectors, you're allowed access to this more robust dispute settlement system. And what's unusual to me is it's not just that that's your admission ticket. The dispute doesn't even have to arise under that contract. It can be unrelated to that contract. The contract has to be with the central government. But as I read it, if you've punched that ticket and you have a dispute that arises from some act or omission of a local or provincial government, you have access to the system. So it doesn't have to be a claim with respect to that contract. As I read it, it doesn't even have to be a claim with respect to that particular investment. It could be a claim with respect to another investment. So what's going on here? Why this condition that you have to have one of these contracts in order to bring a claim? Is it, as Marty, I think you were alluding to, a way to insulate the United States from investor state claims, or is there something more going on here? Anybody want to take that, Aaron?
First, I would say that we agree with the interpretation that you've offered, Ted. It's a very complex construction that provides eligibility, and you have to trace your eligibility through lots of different interconnected bits of text in that annex of this investment agreement. So the mere complexity of it, I think, is one reason why we don't view it as a good precedent. It raises questions that will have to be interpreted and resolved over time by lawyers and by others who are parsing the eligibility that it does and may not offer. I would say that we would view it largely as probably a defensive measure, a construction that the U.S. has put forward in ways to limit the eligibility in the other direction of Mexican firms that may make ISDS claims against the United States, while still preserving in more of an asymmetric way the eligibility of U.S. firms that will be able to make claims against any Mexican breaches of investment protections. The one I think clear-cut case of eligibility that you can see illustrated through our sector for these covered agreements is precisely those bid rounds that I mentioned that some U.S. and U.S. allied companies have been successful in winning in recent years. When you win one of those bid rounds in the upstream in Mexico in exploration and production, then you sign an agreement with the National Hydrocarbons Commission in Mexico. I think most would clearly see that provides you eligibility for ISDS. And just as Ted said, it's not just for the investment that you make that's subject to that particular auction that you won, through which you're signing an agreement with the National Hydrocarbons Commission in Mexico. Let's say that you also have other investments in Mexico that maybe weren't even potentially subject to needing to win any sort of an auction or enter into any sort of an agreement with the Mexican government. You engaged in a purely private investment, much as we think of the way that investments are made here in the United States. By virtue of just having a current agreement for some other part of your business in Mexico, you're eligible then to bring a claim against a breach of an investment protection that may affect any other of your investments in Mexico, so long as you have one of those agreements in place. So it's a very interesting kind of keyhole that provides you eligibility for a potentially broader set of eligibility for your investments in Mexico. That's quite curious and complex, and our preferences would be to just keep it simple, make ISDS eligibility for all sectors, even for covered sectors like ours, not to make it so complex, so as you'd have to trace your eligibility back to something that's not so maybe enduring over the long term.
Yeah, I think also, I think these provisions are confusing and this requirement is confusing, and I think there'll be a lot of litigation over the requirement and whether, as you say, it's like a broad gateway to the universe of claims or whether it's something narrower. But of course, there's many cases where it might be a provincial or state government who's responsible for licensing or auctioning, etc. You look at some of the claims that have been made against Canada. Those are actually provincial governments that have acted inconsistently with their NAFTA obligations. And if there was no reason to have this broader centralized authority government contract, then they're not protected. And in some of those cases, Canada settled, so they agreed that their provinces had actually violated the investment protections under NAFTA. So I think it is another arbitrary distinction, and I think it could leave a hole for protection even for these favored sectors, depending on how they're regulated. I do think on the defensive side, once you look at the U.S. government's government procurement carve-outs to protect Buy America, and then you overlay the fact that you would need to have like the specific contract with the federal government, it does narrow the protections considerably, or at least the access to this enforcement mechanism for Mexican investors with the United States.
I don't have too much to add here except that I would echo what Aaron said. I mean, in an ideal world for the chemical sector in the United States, Canada would opt back in. I think that's a high priority for us. And there would be no limitation on the types of sectors, number of sectors that can make claims on the full set of investment protections. It's a simple solution. There's no ambiguity there, and I don't think it invites that type of simple solution. It doesn't invite questions about who's in and who's out.
And I'd like to ask a question of you. So you pointed out that your member companies, when they're doing business in Mexico, would not typically enter into a contract with the central government. The base for their establishment in Mexico would be a private contract. Is there a possible dynamic that could kick in as a result of this contract requirement where parties start negotiating with the central government, with the Mexican central government, so that they can get access to this system? It's sort of a tail wagging the dog type of dynamic where there's no inherent reason to be negotiating a contract with the central government, but you do it to get access to this kind of insurance policy. And perhaps in the course of that negotiation, the government's able to extract a price, knowing that that's the very reason that parties are negotiating. Do you see that kind of dynamic kicking in if your member companies were covered?
That's an interesting question, Ted. I think it does create some perverse incentives for companies to create greater connections with the national authorities in order to get that backstop for their investments. And so, if this goes into effect, I mean, I think you'll see, change in business behavior based on Canada's transition out of ISDS, and then, certainly, I think a number of companies who are invested in Mexico will have to consider how best to preserve their investments and how best to protect them.
But Ted, it's so ironic, right? The United States was a big champion of Mexico's energy reform in 2013 to try to get the government out of micromanaging these sectors and let U.S. investment in. Usually, the U.S. is supportive of either deregulation or smart regulation, so there's less red tape for U.S. investors in Mexico, so there's more transparency. And as Ed alluded to before, many U.S. investors are just covered by the general regulatory regime. Why would it be in the U.S. interest to create this perverse incentive to actually create more centralized regulation of U.S. investments that's irrational, because it would only be an add-on from the current regime? So I would hope that doesn't happen, and if it does, I think it's directly contrary to where U.S. policy generally has been headed in terms of treatment of U.S. investors in Mexico.
Let's take this one step further. If having a contract with the central government is the price of admission, it's the keyhole that allows you access to this more robust form of ISDS, there's of course the risk that on the eve of a claim being brought to arbitration, the government terminates the contract to essentially deprive you of access to this system. Now, there is a paragraph in Annex 14E that appears to anticipate that risk, and it says something to the effect that if a contract is terminated for reasons that are contrary to this chapter, essentially that termination is to be disregarded. Of course, that just begs the question, what does it mean to terminate a contract for reasons that are contrary to this chapter? The very nature of contract is that you're allowed to enter into them and you're allowed to exit them. So what do you think about the idea of seeing a dispute coming over the horizon? The government says, we don't consider this contract in our best interests anymore. We're exercising our right to terminate, and lo and behold, that seems to cause jurisdiction with respect to this future investor state claim to disappear. Any thoughts on that?
That particular provision that you referenced, Ted, is important. In our member company's view, it is sufficient to guard against that possibility that a government would abrogate a contract on the eve of an ISDS claim that they may not feel they're in a position to be able to defend well against. So there may be arguments around whether or not abrogation of a contract is done in such a way that the chapter would seemingly say is not allowed. But we appreciate that provision is in the chapter, and we believe that it should act as a sufficient deterrent for a government abrogating a contract in bad faith, precisely to avoid being subject to a claim that an investor might make against an investment protection breach.
I do think also in discussions we have about the ISDS enforcement mechanism, sometimes we give it more power than it's due. If you have a multi-million or multi-billion-dollar investment in a country, that's a complex investment. It's important to that host government. It's important to the company that's invested there. Would hypothetically the host state walk away from the contract to try to avoid ISDS? Hypothetically, yes. But the truth is that both of those parties are going to be working very hard to resolve the dispute. The host government is going to want to either keep the investor there if they can, and probably the dispute is usually brewing for so long before you actually trigger investor-state dispute settlements, as this is the nuclear option often, that I think it might be quite clear whether they basically decided to back away from the contract once they got the notice letter. So, my feeling is it was good to make that explicit and put a marker down. But the reality of how these disputes unfold is that they're simmering for a long time, and an investor state enforcement mechanism is a last resort. And so I don't think that you're going to see host states wanting to walk away from a concession agreement that underscores a multi-billion-dollar investment easily unless everything's really gone south.
Let's pivot to what I've been calling the annex for everybody else. So you have the annex for the 5, and then the annex for everybody else. In opening remarks, we talked about the fact that that there are limitations under ISDS under that annex. It's confined to claims with respect to national treatment, MFN, and direct expropriation. There's an exhaustion requirement. I think, Ed, you made the observation that that it only applies with respect, it doesn't apply with respect to pre-investment denial of market access. So you can only access this system once you've actually made an investment and have a claim with the way your investment's been treated. With all of these limitations, is this essentially dead on arrival, or is there still something useful here that might benefit companies either through actual use of the Annex 14D system or because of the deterrent effect that Marnie was alluding to in her remarks?